While some artists like Goya reveled in the chaotic label of Romanticism, other artists tried to reject that label and have only later been classified as Romanticists or had romantic elements in their work recognized by art historians. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres is a good example of this. He is a member of the French Academy of Fine Arts, and he actually sees the movement of Romanticism as too undisciplined and too uncontrolled, and strives during his lifetime to distance himself from that movement. However, later art historians have really seen his work as having many romantic elements. Unlike Goya's painting that we saw in the last video, where that emotional impact is immediately apparent, Ingres' work seems much more tame on the surface. But this painting is one of those paintings that the longer you look at it, the more romantic it gets. Ingres himself looks back to the painters of the 16th century, but not those controlled mathematical painters of the High Renaissance, instead the more experimental painters of mannerism. And if we look at a painting like this, the debt to mannerism is clear. Her position right off the bat is quite unusual. She's reclined on her side, but that lower leg crosses up and over her upper leg. But just take a second and look closely at the proportions of her body. Her body proportions are extremely unusual. You might notice her extremely long back and spine. You might notice that that leg that crosses over her upper leg terminates in shadow. It doesn't really seem to quite attach to the body, and the knee and the proportions seem to be in the wrong place. And that we emphasize certain parts of the body. That while this figure is, for instance, overall quite slender, her hips and her buttocks, those areas that feature sexual attraction, are quite large and exaggerated. Similarly, we see her breast, which is quite an unnatural shape, but also it's quite far over into her armpit and in an unusual location. And again, we're seeing those parts of the body that have sexual implications or sexual connotations, even though that's not a naturalistic position or naturalistic size for those parts of the body. The other romantic element in this painting, though, comes from the implied content. This painting was heavily criticized when it was first shown to the public because of these mismatches between Goya's odd proportions and the obvious skills of the objects around him. The draperies, the cloth of the bed that she reclines on are all done in a highly skilled manner. And that's what people said at the time, is this person can obviously paint, but what happened with this woman? That she's weird and slightly uncomfortable. However, if we dig more deeply into this and we look closely at her surroundings, we might get a hint at why viewers in the 19th century would have been uncomfortable with this painting. If we had to guess where she is, we can look at some clues. She's lying down, but it doesn't appear to be that she's on a bed. She seems to be on some cushions, kind of on a couch, or possibly even on cushions on the floor. She holds in her extended arm a fan made of peacock feathers. Peacocks are exotic birds, and at this time they're associated with the Middle East and North Africa. And if we follow that all the way down to her feet, we see an elaborate pipe by her feet, and it isn't tobacco in that pipe. So these exotic elements, along with this kind of head wrap rather than a proper hat, suggest that she is in some kind of an exotic location, possibly in the Middle East or North Africa. These more distant cultures, with different ways of life, were new in the early 19th century. As France expands its empire, these different kinds of people are coming more into contact with French people. And there's also a fear in the early 19th century of this idea of white slavery. These ideas are very much rooted in the ideas of racism, but we do think at this time that people of color, black and brown men, are sexually uncontrolled. And this goes for black and brown women too, although we see it depicted less often in art. But there's this idea that these men in the Middle East and in North Africa are going to kidnap or abduct white women and hold them in sexual slavery. And that's what we see implied here. That this woman, she looks very white, she looks very European, but she's surrounded by these objects that are exotic. She's dressed in exotic ways. She is presenting herself in a way that a respectable European woman would not, with clothes on, and she doesn't seem to be uncomfortable, or she doesn't seem to be trying to escape. So there is this discomfort or this kind of culture clash, which has a deep-seated racist root, which makes this painting more romantic and makes that kind of uncomfortable feeling in an early 19th century viewer that causes this painting, despite its skill level, to be categorized by many art historians today as romantic.